At first, a warm welcome to all of you and to our great speakers for making the time to come and speak at today's economic seminars. My name is Julia. I'm a lecturer here in economics at the Open University, with colleagues, we've set up this OU Economic Seminar Series, which really should be a space to have academics and people engaged in research discussing with activists and policymakers, people from industry. So a shout out to Christina, who really has been the mastermind behind this economics seminar. And obviously, we're very happy to have the three of you here today to speak to us about inequality, protest, and the cost of living crisis, which is very timely here in the UK, but also in other parts of the world. So it's really great to have you here. And yeah, in terms of housekeeping, the event is going to be recorded, and we're going to make it available via our channels. And we hope that maybe a few more people will join over the course of the seminar as soon as we've put it out on Twitter. And people can access the new link. In terms of order, I'm going to say a few words about you and your biographies in a second, but we'll hear first from Lucia, who is a senior lecturer at KCL. And again, I'm going to say a few more words around it in a second. We'll then have Chiara, who's going to speak to us about tax systems, and then we have Baba Aya. So really three great speakers here today. And then after your presentations, we'll open it up and we'll take questions and try and have a discussions around, I'm sure, the many very important and interesting things that you raise. So just in terms of biography, Lucia, as I said, is a senior lecturer at KCL. She's also the vice president at the UCU branch, the trade union at KCL, which is great, again, to show the interlinkage between being an academic and an activist at the same time. She has done research and published extensively on labor, migration, imperialism, and new workers' movements. So we're really looking forward to hearing from her. We also have Chiara Putaturo with us, who is a tax policy advisor and at the Oxfam EU office. So it's really great to have you here. Also very timely, Oxfam just published a recent report on inequality. It's not looking good, so it's really great to have you here. Important to hear from you. Chiara, before she joined Oxfam, was working with Transparency International. So she too has a lot of experience in this area. With an academic background in political science and development economics. So welcome. And lastly, we have Baba Aya here with us, who is the Health and Social Sector Officer at Public Services International. So also great to have you here. PSI is the global union federation of around 30 million public sector workers worldwide. Maybe the number has increased by now, but a massive number of people, obviously. Baba is also the co-president of the Geneva Global Health Hub, a self-identified eco-socialist and poet, and it's great to have you here, former deputy national secretary of the Labour Party in Nigeria. So without taking too much more time, I'm handing over to Lucia, and I'll be sharing the screen so I can share your slides, or do you want to click through your slides yourself?
I'm very happy for you to do it. Thank you.
Great. Let me do that.
And thanks for the introduction. Okay, so thanks, Julia, and thanks to all the organizers for inviting me, and hello, everyone. In my talk today, I'm going to discuss about the rise of a new labor movement in the UK and in the wake of the cost of living crisis, and reflect on its future prospects. Many commentators have drawn parallels between this movement and the winter of discontent in the UK in the 1978-79. And actually, both movements are a reaction on the part of the working class to high inflation and declining living standards. But the political situation is different because in the 70s, it was the Labour government led by James Callaghan that was facing down a highly unionized workforce in a wave of strikes that involved up to 4.6 million workers and that affected everything from transport, hospital work to grave digging. And the government eventually negotiated an end to the strikes in February 1971, but these in the end led voters to switching to Margaret Thatcher just a month later. So the question today is Rishi Sunak facing a similar fate, and what will come next? What are the prospects for this movement? Sorry, can you move to the next slide? Okay, so this was basically the question that I'm trying to answer today. So I think that in order to answer this question, it's important first to say a few words about the political economy context, because in the 70s, stagflation, so rising inflation and unemployment, reflected a structural crisis of accumulation and profitability. And even if workers managed to get a pay rise in 1979, the crisis eventually led to the rise of neoliberalism and monetarism, with frontal attacks starting in the UK on unions' rights and a major restructuring of the UK economy. And this took place in a period of expansion of the US-led hegemonic order, first in the global south and then in the former Soviet Union. And this period of expansion underpinned the neoliberal recovery between the early 80s and the mid-1990s. Rising inflation today expresses the multidimensional crisis of this very system of accumulation that first erupted in the global financial crisis in 2007-2008 and hasn't been solved since. High inflation, from my point of view, and I agree with Michael Roberts, but also, for example, Stiglitz just a few days ago, in saying that this inflation is linked to the shocks and supply chain interruptions due to both climate catastrophe and the COVID-19 pandemic. But the pandemic, rather than being a kind of exogenous factor, as the mainstream economists say, shows how the pathogens born out of the destruction of ecosystems spill back into society, amplified by the privatization of healthcare and social protection systems. And the war in Ukraine is a symptom, moreover, of the terminal crisis of the unipolar world order under US hegemony that has underpinned the period of neoliberal recovery between the early 80s and the mid-90s. So importantly, the shortages in the global economy have allowed companies with sufficient market power to hike their margins, as exemplified by the record profits of energy companies like Shell and BP. And in this context, as Stiglitz argues, monetary policies actually reduces inflation only at the cost of working people purchasing power. But I think it's important to highlight that the consequences are not only distributive, because working people facing hunger and destitution are forced to work longer hours or take on other jobs just to be able to afford food for themselves or their children, or heating their homes, etc. So depressing wages, which is the kind of conscious policy of the government, has also the effect of increasing exploitation. And this is, I think, conscious goals aimed at counteracting the lack of economic dynamism and the long-term decline in the rate of profit, as highlighted by Michael Roberts. Next slide, please. In the summer of 2022, however, something started to change in Britain, and we witnessed the emergence of a new labor movement that started from the private sector and spread to the public sector. And I think that the experience of workers in the pandemic is key in order to explain this emergence, because many of the workers who initiated the strike last summer were considered to be essential workers during the pandemic, and so had to carry on their normal work despite the risks to their health and lives. These are refuse workers, carry drivers, transport workers, postal workers, dockers, and so on. And at the beginning, they accepted pay freezes during the first phase of the pandemic, but at the same time, their role as essential workers also boosted their consciousness and sense of power and also their potential for disruption. And when in the second phase, when lockdown ended and the profitable firms offered below inflation pay rises, they actually got quite angry. And and this, of course, mixed to their self-confidence, pushed them to take action. And this self-confidence was further amplified when the economy reopened in the autumn of 2021, because these exposed major labor shortages, for example, lorry drivers, and therefore gave more confidence to workers that they could actually achieve at least pay rises above inflation. Can we move to the next slide, please? So what are the characteristics of what we could call a new labor movement emerging? So the first thing to say is that this movement started from the private sector and then spread to the public sector. So it started in the summer of 2022 among rail workers, British Telecom, Royal Mail workers. And then along with these national disputes, there was a massive increase in local disputes in the private sector, especially organized by Unite the Union. For example, lorry drivers in good transport, bus drivers, refuse workers. And we also witnessed a revival of action by dockers, for example, with the 8-day strike at Felixstowe or the Liverpool dockers strike. And we also saw some major confrontations in manufacturing. And there has also been an outbreak of unofficial or wildcat action, for example, among workers across multiple oil and gas rigs in the North Sea, but also unofficial action across Amazon warehouses in August 2022. And this movement that started in the private sector then spread to the public sector, including the university sector with both Unison and the UCU, ambulance drivers, paramedics, nurses, firefighters, teachers, and support staff and civil servants from government departments, ports, airports, and the driving test centers. I think that an important common denominator among these struggles is not just pay, but also the question of working times and conditions, and more broadly, the question of power relations at work. So it's both a question of pay, but it's also a question of the quality of work and the control over working times and more in general, working conditions. And I think this is something that has been consciously underplayed by the media and the government. I have examples of, I don't know, Sky News coming to our pickets at King's, and everyone was like stressing elements beyond the pay element. But then when they go on TV, they just want to talk about the pay. But this is really not the case. And I think that what happened over the summer with Mick Lynch becoming a kind of spokesperson and interpreting the kind of change of feelings among workers was the idea that, yeah, well, we refuse to be poor, but poverty as linked to the quality of work and the power relations, and the idea that as workers we have the power to change things. We have power in our hands. And so when basically hostile media tried to interview Mick Lynch and trying to divide workers among sectors, he refused this and actually said, well, I'm talking for everyone. I'm not just talking for the rail workers. And this is actually what has happened, in the sense that this movement has spread beyond the rail sector, also in other sectors. Can we just move to the next slide, please? 1 second. And I think that there is a kind of, Mick Lynch was able to give voice to a class consciousness that is rising among workers. And this is, for example, an interview that an Arriva bus driver gave. And he says, well, we know it's a very wrong society. I drive across London where you can see the 1 million houses and the 3 million houses for some, as well as the big estates where there's a lot of people worried about their fuel bills and the cost of a big shop. There was a woman I know who gets on my bus, and I've known her for years. We nod and smile at each other, and she thanks me when she gets off. One day she said to me, I might not be coming on the bus anymore. So I asked why, and she quickly said very quiet, because I'm not going to Tesco's anymore. I'm walking to a food bank. That was it, a 10-second chat, but it summed up a lot for me. So it's just the idea that workers know that what they're experiencing is not just their sectoral problem, but is part of a class problem that involves everyone among the working class. Can we just go back? Sorry, one second. And so even if this is not often kind of made explicit by the union leaders, this strike raises very important political demands, like, for example, questions around the privatization of the NHS, questions about the nature of public services, and at the same time has also found quite a lot of sympathy, rising sympathy among the population. One, because especially in the wake of COVID, there is a recognition of the contribution of many of the essential workers, in particular hospital staff, during the pandemic, but also, of course, because everyone is affected by rising inflation and the cost of living crisis. Okay, can we move to the next after the next? Okay, very quickly, I think that the government's response has been to cast himself as a moderate Tory. So after blocking negotiations on race and NHS, now there are some openings to negotiations, and also is extending energy bill help for 3 months in order to basically curb the rise of this labor movement. At the same time, he's also pressing ahead with anti-union legislation that enforce minimum services standards and has been basically defined as incompatible with human rights law. And it's also trying with, well, the example is Suella Braverman trying to co-opt the Enough is Enough slogan against refugees in order, so trying to divert the anger among workers into a kind of anti-immigrant and anti-refugees hatred, a move that has been kind of denounced by the main trade unions, who basically denounced the Tories' attempt to use racism to divide the working class, and also denounced their responsibilities in fueling far-right violence against refugees. Okay, can we just move to the next slide? I'm conscious that my time is almost coming to an end. On the other side, well, it's clear that the Labour Party, with Starmer attacking the left, etc., is not trying to build on this labour movement in order to create a kind of real alternative to the government. And this is a kind of perceived by workers on strike who don't think that the Labour Party is really an alternative, even if probably they will vote against the Tories. But this has also shifted debates from the parliamentary level onto the level of strategy. So this is not necessarily a bad thing. So I just want to move to the final point, because I think one of the main differences between the 70s and today concerns the nature of action itself. Can we move? Sorry, Julia. So in the 70s, strikes generally were indefinite, and they were either run from below by shop stewards committees, or increasingly became run from the top. In many cases, like the Ford strikes, they were initiated by members against the will of the union bureaucracies. And indefinite action, and they often led to indefinite action that also favored coordination between different sectors, leading to mass demonstrations and millions of workers out at the same time. And what happened after this winter of discontent is that Thatcher actually sought to avoid and basically prevent also this kind of action with anti-union legislation that banned, for example, secondary picketing or spontaneous strikes. And what we see today is that for decades of anti-union legislation has actually reinforced the grip of the bureaucracy over the trade union movement. And for this reason, strikes continue to be too short, sporadic, fragmented, and uncoordinated. On the one side, we have the RMT, the kind of Enough is Enough, the unions affiliated to Enough is Enough, who have organized very limited action with often very limited results in terms of pay offers. On the other side, we have Unite, that where we have indefinite local action, also with significant achievements, but still below the demands of the workers and very little coordination. So I think just to conclude, the latest example is that a series of unions like the RMT, the Royal College of Nursing, or UCU suspended action in order to either vote on a pay offer or enter periods of so-called very intense negotiations. But of course, in this way, control over the strike, the momentum, and the coordination is basically back in the hands of the government or the employers. So, and of course, the RMT suspending action is also weakening momentum around the protest on Budget Day. So these kind of strategies risk actually not putting sufficient pressure on the government and maybe achieve limited results in terms of pay offers, but not kind of challenging the overall political strategy. But in the end, I think it's important to highlight that it will be the strength of the labor movement and its capacity to take control over their action and over their unions that will give the final answer to the question of what's next after this wave of strikes. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Lucia. Already, I'm sure, loads of food for thought. Just in the interest of time, we're going to have all three presentations at once, and then we'll open up to questions afterwards. But if you have questions, feel free already to put them into the chat, so none of the good ideas and questions get lost. Chiara, do you want me to share my screen, or do you want to share the slides?
Yeah, it would be better if you can share the screen. Thank you very much. No so I have really few slides just for some graphs and some main figures. For the rest, I would just speak. Perfect. So yeah, I'm speaking from Brussels, and also in Belgium this week is a week of strikes in several sectors. So it's really a good moment to organize this seminar. I'm not an expert of workers and workers movement. I'm more an expert on tax inequality. So I would take a step back and give you a big picture of the problem of inequality. Show how workers, according to our analysis, are hit by inequality from different perspectives, and in particular from the perspective of the inequality in the tax system, and also how this can generate protest. So yeah, first you can pass to. Thank you very much. So every year during the World Economic Forum in Davos, Oxfam publishes its inequality report, and each year the new analyses are quite shocking. So this time is the first time in 25 years that extreme wealth and extreme poverty have sharply increased at the same time. And as you can see from this figure, billionaire wealth has doubled over the last decade, and there was even an explosion during the pandemic. But what is even more alarming is to look at the concentration of wealth. And you can pass to the next slide, thanks. So if we look at the last 10 years that are represented by the light green in the figure, we can see that the top 1% have gained 74 times more wealth than the bottom 50%. And if we look just at the period from since the start of the pandemic, that is represented by the dark green columns, we discovered that the richest 1% capture 2/3 of all new wealth, the 63%. That is almost twice of what the rest of the population, the 99%, gain. And so already the speaker before me, Lucia, she mentioned the windfall profit of corporation, and we can pass to the next slide. Thanks. So several billionaires multiplied the fortune. New billionaires appeared during these last years, and this is also thanks to windfall profit of some corporation. In the inequality report that I mentioned, we estimated that in the food and the energy sector, the biggest company increased their profit more than 2.5 times in 2022 compared to the 3 years to the 3 previous years. And what is even more outrageous is that in 2022, 84% of this windfall profit were paid directly to shareholders, so they didn't go into pay of the workers. And there is also an increasing evidence showing that corporate profits are driving at least 50% of inflation in some countries. In the UK, for example, a study shows that corporate profits are responsible for 59% of inflation. So this is what is happening at the top. And on the other side, there is the rest of us, including workers, who pay the consequences of the recent multiple crises. And workers in particular have been hit at least 4 times by cutting jobs and wages, as the previous speakers already mentioned, by suppression of workers' rights, in particular during the pandemic, by an increase of tax burden, and cutting public services. And I would like to say something about these four elements. So when there is an economic crisis, ordinary working people are the first to be hit by pay cuts and job losses. During the pandemic, we estimated that there was a loss of working hours that was 4 times greater than during the global financial crisis. And the women and racialized groups were even more hit. The cost of living crisis exacerbated this trend. And the hyperinflation is creating a cut in the real terms pay for many workers. Here too, we conducted some analysis, and we estimated that in 2022, at least 1.7 million workers lived in countries where inflation was higher than the wage growth. And building on the International Labour Organization data, we estimated that workers face $337 billion cut from their wages in real terms. And again, women and racialized groups are expected to be hit hardest. For example, in the UK, there are some researches that shows that ethnic minority workers are at greater risk of experiencing poverty during the cost of living crisis because they are concentrated in jobs where the pay is below the real living wages. And we have also seen an increase of informal work, particularly for women. This is causing the workers to be more vulnerable to low pay and poor condition. And despite that, we have been also hearing from many politicians and some neoliberal economists that there is a risk of so-called wage price spiral, so that the wages can actually cause the inflation. And so the trade unions, those demanding for a fair pay, have become the scapegoat for the inflation. But actually, the International Labour Organization found no evidence for that. So the second point is about workers' rights. We publish every 2 years a commitment to reducing inequality that look at the government performance in reducing inequality in 160 countries. And there is one pillar that is about the labor rights and fair wages. And using the data from the International Trade Unions Confederation, we showed that there was an increase in the suppression of workers' rights during the COVID-19. The third aspect is the tax system. That is also the sector where I work the most. So we can pass to the next slide. Thanks. So in the last decades, we have seen a decrease of the tax for the richest individual in every region in the world. You can see this has actually two kinds of consequences. On one side, governments had the need to increase taxes on other sector of the society. And you can see from the figure on the right that from 2007 to 2017, the contribution of payroll taxes, taxes on consumption, also personal income tax have increased, while the taxes that usually are paid by the richest individuals, so wealth taxes and corporate income tax, have decreased. This has caused so the tax system to become less progressive, and we ended up in the figure that we can see on the left, where basically the personal income tax, payroll taxes, consumption taxes contribute to the tax revenue today for a much bigger extent than the corporate income tax and the wealth tax. And we open our report with a very symbolic comparison. Elon Musk paid a real tax rate of just over 3% from 2014 to 2018, while Christine, that is a market trader in northern Uganda we worked in, she pays a tax rate of 40%. So this is very emblematic on how unequal the tax system is. And finally, so there were cuts in public services because also of the decrease in tax revenue coming from the richest. This doesn't hit specifically the workers, but every individual, and in particular the most vulnerable. So many governments are choosing or are being forced by international financial institutions to cut public spending. And we have calculated that over the next 5 years, 3/4 of governments are planning to cut spending. So all this is translating in increasing protest, as we have seen in the previous presentation. What I want to highlight here is that is what we detected in terms of public opinion and discontent in relation to the unequal tax system. Fortunately, there are public polling that finds that a majority of people support increased taxation on the wealthy in many countries, even in the US. And on the other side, attempts by governments to impose regressive kind of taxes on the ordinary citizens have brought people on the street. Over the past 5 years, we have examples mass social protests that originated from governments trying to introduce regressive taxes. For example, in France, the Yellow Vest movement emerged as a response to unfair tax increases on fuel. And I would like to end with an example, thanks, of protests where workers, but also civil society organizations, trade unions engaged not only to ask for better working conditions and also more environmental sustainable policies, but also to protest against tax avoidance practices. And we are talking about Amazon, and we are talking about the campaign on Make Amazon Pay. Oxfam is partner of it, and also Public Services International is in it. It takes place every year during around the Black Friday. Two protests also exactly about the tax avoidance practices that this digital giant is involved in. To give an example, we know from public available data that in 2021, the European division of Amazon that is based in Luxembourg, and where all he reports all the revenue coming from the sales from all over Europe, including the UK. They did not pay any taxes because they just reported losses for accounting, thanks to accounting gains, even if they increased their sales by 17%. So to conclude, this level of inequality that is very visible in the unequal tax system has really become unacceptable. I've shown as workers have been hit in different ways, and protests of citizens and of workers are a clear evidence of this increasing discontent and this unsustainable system. So governments and companies should really listen to it because this is a symptom of the crisis of the social contract. And to end with the good news, the fact that in October 2022, the British government was forced to reverse his plan to tax cut for the rich, and even the IMF warned the government that these cuts would have been negative for equality, and really discouraged the government to do that. This is a good sign because, I mean, even international financial institutions are a bit changing position. And I will stop there. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Chiara. I think you making us all angry, which hopefully will push us into even more action, hearing what's going on. I'm handing over right away to Baba Aye for your presentation, and then we'll open up the floor for questions and discussion. Baba, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Julia, and thanks, Lucia and Chiara, for those beautiful presentations. Well, my point of departure will be twofold. One taken from Lucia. I'm happy she did speak about this being something like the winter of discontent. And what comes to my mind then is how that winter, end of 1970s, was a decade after 1968, and then you had the energy crisis, and so somewhat it's like what we are witnessing now, the fight back as well as the crisis of cost of living. When you look at it, it's the peaking of a moment that started with the beginning of the 21st century, or if we will, the end of last century. And with this, when you also look at the dimensions, which is the second point of departure of the centrality of class and how the fight back against exploitation, links to it and shows the interconnections of the fight back against oppression. My mind goes back to the Battle of Seattle, You know, and the New York Times headlines of the Teamsters and Turtles Unite, you know, talking about the working class and the environmental civil society movement. So those two points provide the thread for the fabric that I'll speak to of working class struggle at this moment, and the question of what is to be done or what could be done. It's very significant. You've had historic strikes. For the first time, talking of the UK, for the first time in 106 years, nurses went on strike. You know, and in the US, for example, you saw after, you know, even during COVID-19, during the lockdown, you had creative means, you know, working class trade unions drew from a repertoire of strikes in different ways, like the National Nurses United. You know, you had things like rolling strikes and people putting empty shoes to represent their colleagues that had been lost to, you know, an avoidable extent of the impact of the pandemic, and all this, even the pandemic, the extent of unpreparedness reflects what's decades of cuts in public funding, you know, the neoliberal paradigm of capitalist development had brought to bear, you know. So, but with we're not really at the end of the pandemic. We're at its twilight, because it's not really over until it's all over. In the US, you saw, you know, last year you had some 424 strikes involving about 250,000 people, as against in 2021, where you had, you know, 279 involving some 140,000. And it's 2023, and that's according to Cornell University. And 2023 is, you've already seen waves of things. And it's not only in the North America and in Europe, beyond even the UK. You've seen massive strikes in France and Spain. And talking of the repertoire of struggle, one of the things you see within Spain, and this is with the health workers, you saw communities, not only civil society movement now, you saw communities coming out in support of and fighting with health workers and their unions, you know, for the right to health, for public health, you know. So these are important developments flowing from over the past almost a quarter of a century. Then in Asia Pacific, in Indonesia, you've seen massive strikes, you know, against laws, and I think it was also Lucia that pointed out that in these strikes, you also, it's not only called for increase in wages, which is legitimate, you know, but also for improved working conditions. Also, you know, for even issues beyond bread and butter. Last year, I think that was in April, we had probably the largest strike in history, 200 million workers in India for 2 days. And the demands also carried along demands for in defense of, you know, poor farmers, the informal economy, social security for informal economy people. So you are seeing solidarity in the clearest terms of working class people being demonstrated in this unfolding moment of revolts of the working class. I was at a webinar yesterday towards the forthcoming Global Forum on Human Resources for Health, and someone suggested that probably we should have an health workforce rebellion campaign similar to the XR, and I was like, you have a point. Yes, probably we could also now conceptualize it like that. But you're actually already having an ongoing health workforce rebellion, huh? You know, you're already having that. So, and interestingly, you have even platform workers in different parts. I mean, Terry has spoken of Amazon, and so, but in Asia, one of the things I found significant was that you did not only last year have strikes in, South Korea, Hong Kong, and Thailand. You saw expression of solidarity, when the South Korea, before the South Koreans went on strike, those in Hong Kong had gone, and those in South Korea expressed solidarity with them. So these are very significant. Now, talking of how the centrality of class and how the struggle against exploitation has taken on struggles against different forms of oppressions, I would zero in on two. One, what you had in the period of the Black Lives Matter protests, which itself was historic. Thousands of workers dropped their tools. Thousands of workers supported the BLM movement, as workers. Then the second I would zero in. So that shows how the class struggle, has also taken some clearly anti-racist stand. But also Iran, how it has taken the anti-patriarchal stance. And in this I would like to draw from what Parveen Mohammadi raised. She's been vice president of the Free Union of Workers of Iran for a while, and she pointed out that look, the struggle in Iran, which was sparked by the death of Mahsa Amini whilst he was in morality police custody, it's brought in the working class. But in showing that, there's another angle to point out to this. The conflation of the working class, the trade unions, and the trade union bureaucracy is something that we tend to do almost unconsciously. But I think it's important to grasp the dynamics between these three different, but of course closely intertwined elements of the labor movement. And like, for example, in Iran, which is why I started with that, you haven't seen the trade unions coming in, in their formal sense. But as Parveen pointed out, those coming out, are workers and children of workers. Those being killed, are workers. So you see these dimensions. And why are we having this peak? Why? For time, it might not make more sense to go into how these things unfolded. And I think Lucia did a great job, and also Charia, in showing how you have seen this with regards to the decline in profitability and tax. Austerity measures. Last year, 134 countries started implementing austerity measures to different extent. And often when even governments speak about cost of living crisis, they don't underscore this. Years of austerity contributed to lead to where we are now, which essentially is about making the poor working class people to bear the burden of the crisis of the capitalists. And it's bad, but it's getting worse. By IMF's projections, by the end of this year, that number would have increased to 143 countries. So the struggle ahead is even more tortuous. And here I want to go to the question of, in my view, what is to be done? What are some of the challenges to, because look, let's face the fact, this period will pass in one way or the other. Capitalism will stabilize itself if it is not defeated. Because crisis is inherent to its DNA. Yeah? It's written into its DNA. And the challenge then is, how do we, you might say, fan the embers of revolt into fires of revolution? In 2012, I did argue that, when I was talking about that, we were entering an era of crisis and revolt. And the Arab Spring was the sharpest reflection of this. And it is not accidental. I mean, often when people talk of the Arab Spring, they talk of Tahrir Square, but they don't talk of the working class wing behind the scenes of that moment. In Sudan, it was even more starkly out there in our face. It started with strikes, you know, the Sudanese, the SPA, then, you know, the railway workers and all that. But, and this is both a problem, but in a sense, the reality, because we change history, we change the world, but we inherit both pros and cons of ideological, political, structural, and so on and so forth. And I think that limitations, despite, as you can see, and this is the important bit, is, you know, the demands go beyond just bread and butter, not just, because even bread and butter is important, but the limitations of demands to reforms, no matter how radical, of the system gives leeway for the system to stabilize itself. At best, by giving major concessions, but more often than not, by even dumbing down the concessions it will give. And I will explain that. In 2010, at the Global Labour University Conference, I did point out, when we're trying to understand, okay, why? Because when Lehman Brothers collapsed and all that, there was that, oh, this is the terminal crisis of capitalism, you know, rise up for the final conflict and all that kind of a thing. And we're like, okay, what did happen? And I said that, look, it's like, I came up with an analogy that it's like, if you were in hell, assuming you had somewhere so hot like that, I mean, and with climate change, we can imagine there being such. And you try to negotiate with the devil to make you more comfortable there and give you some coolness. The devil realizes you're just not serious. But if you fight to get the hell out of hell, even if you don't succeed, is there ready to sit with you on the table to put an air conditioner or a fan in your corner? Although the fan could make the heat worse, but you get the idea. And that is what you had. I mean, we've spoken, different historical moments reflect themselves in different ways in subsequent moments. We've looked at this as probably a winter of discontent, but we can also look at it as the period of post-World War II strikes and protests, which, just like these two, didn't start with post-World War II, which started in the 1930s with the sit-in strikes of the CIO in the US, with the hunger marches in Britain, and so on and so forth. And there's this anecdotal that which I've come across a couple of times. And in a sense, when in Geoff Pilley's writings on Keynes, which reflected, someone said that, I mean, in the House of Lords, there was that if we don't give them reforms, they will win revolution. So the whole idea of the Keynesian welfare national state was because people asked for much more than a comfortable corner in hell. The working class and its allies, we need to dream dreams, have visions, and fight for much more than a better managed capitalist system. We need to envision and fight to win a post-capitalist, to be quite explicit, a socialist world. Yes, of course, I mean, the monstrosities that was the so-called actually existing socialism didn't help the argument of socialism being a post-capitalism. But I mean, obviously, capitalism itself is not working. That's what we're seeing. So I think, and this is where I'll sum up, we need to fight for much more than what we are fighting for, without prejudice to the importance of what we're fighting for in this moment of the cost of living crisis, the cost of profitability crisis, and the crisis, climate crisis, and environmental emergency. And I would want to end drawing from Rosa Luxemburg. You know, she did say that the choices were socialism or barbarism. I think we have gone beyond that. We're actually living through a period of barbarism. The alternatives, in my view, are socialism or, to draw from XR, extinction. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Barbara, for this really great presentation. And shall we all give all three speakers a virtual round of applause? Thanks, Lucia, Chiara, and Barbara, for really three great presentations. So in the interest of time, unfortunately, we only have like 10 minutes left for discussions. So I think the best thing would be, I'm going to collect a few questions and then give every speaker a few more minutes towards the end to respond. So are there any questions? Please feel free to raise your hand, unmute yourself, and ask your questions. Great. I see, Susan, you have your hand up. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Thanks for those presentations. They were excellent, but also really depressing. And also wonderful to see this in an economics seminar. I've been to meetings like this outside of academia, but it's great to see them within an academic context. So my question is very broad, really. I mean, there's two questions. One is, what can we do about it? That's the broader question. What do we need to do? And the second is really, what can economists do? What should economists be doing in order to, to reverse this and to change things? Yeah, that's it. Thanks, by the way. Thanks all.
Great. Thanks, Susan. Yeah, very interesting question for us here. I see there's one question also in the chat from Andrew to Lucia. Is there evidence of any revival of the shop steward movement? Maybe you can pick that up as well. And Zach has his hand up as well. Please go ahead.
A question to all the speakers, really. I think Lucia started with the point that often the strikes have been about a range of issues, including privatisation or of workload, a number of things other than just above inflation pay rise. But often the way it's reported and union leaders, when they're on TV, it just comes down, it's reduced to getting above inflation pay rise. So given what you've all talked about, Chiara's presentation as well, around just the scale of profitability going towards people at the top of society, how important is it to that the strikers learn and connect with the wider movements? We've seen how effective climate demonstrations and Black Lives Matter demonstrations have been over the last few years. How important is that they connect with broader political demands?
Great. Thanks a lot, Zach, for that question as well. Important. Gary, please, question as well.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you very much for those brilliant presentations. And there was me thinking that class was a thing of the past. We've been told for years that class was dead, and shock, we hear it all mentioned now. I mean, I didn't feel this was depressing at all. I thought it was actually quite inspiring to hear that the great work that you're doing. Now, I'm not in economics, so please don't hold this against me, but I'm in social policy criminology at the OU, but I'm based in Scotland. And one of the things I wanted to say was we have to be careful that we don't treat the UK as a homogenous whole, because there are different battles and different strikes going on in different parts of the UK. And one of the things that is quite important up here has been the relationship between the trade union movement and the campaign for Scottish independence, which, despite the rhetoric of the Labour Party and some of the newspapers, has never been identity-based struggle, but has always been a struggle to create a different kind of Scottish society in which public sector work and the delivery of public services was always absolutely central. So there are other things going on that I think connect labour movement struggles, trade union struggles, class and nation in different parts of the UK. And I just wanted to maybe make that observation more than anything, but thanks for your presentations. Great stuff, colleagues. Yeah.
Great, thanks very much, Gary. Are there any more questions? Anyone else wants to ask a question? If not, maybe I can just abuse my power as chair and just add one question to the catalog, just because many of you have obviously touched up on the issue that like loads of the healthcare workers during the pandemic that were also called into the country, into the UK, were migrant workers, have migrant background already. Barbara, I've mentioned BLM and like people coming out in solidarity. So I just wonder, like, if we now look at the rhetoric, for example, of the UK government in terms of like stop the boats and like this whole anti-immigration kind of sentiment that's trying to be stirred up. But also if we look into a place like Nigeria we had like this massive End SARS movement where people came together, and now like again seeing some form of division around like presidential elections. How can we make sure that anti-racist struggles continue to be like really part of these ongoing efforts in terms of strike action? I'm not sure if there are no other questions, then every speaker would have like 2 minutes to respond to this very broad range of questions. And if that's okay, we'll just restart in the order of presentations. So I'll give Lucia the word first.
Sorry, can I go second? Sorry.
Sure, not a problem. Chiara, do you want to go first? Or
yeah. I can go first.
Sure, yeah, perfect. Thank you.
So I will try a bit to combine the answer. What can we do about it? And I think that this is very much linked also at the other question. How is it important to link the workers' protests with also other kind of protest, including the anti-racist movement? Because I think it's important to start from the message that this is not something that affects just a small group. It doesn't affect just the workers, but as it was mentioned before, it's a class that is affected, or actually it's the 99% even of the population. And so this is the first thing, I mean, to be aware of, and also to communicate. And then it's important to help, I mean, every citizens can do it, help in simplify the message and showing how, so it's not a single problem, but is a systemic problem, as Baba presented very well. And everything is interlinked, starting, I mean, from my sector of expertise, that is tax. And there the economists can play a really important role, because I mean, for decades we have had the dominance of the neoliberal economy, and there was this narrative of the trickle-down economics that were saying that if we cut tax on the rich, then they will produce richness that will trickle down to the rest of the population. But today we see with our eyes that this is not true. But there are still some like strong resistance. And so the role of the economists is also to, I mean, the bank, to help the banking, these theories that still exist, and helping also in simplifying the messages, because I think everybody should be able to understand how this economic system works, and helping in the banking it. So yeah, I would close there.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Chiara. Lucia, do you want to go second, or shall we go on to Baba?
Okay, Baba.
Great, thank you. Thanks.
Right. Well, for brevity, the question of what can economists do? I mean, what can we do? I mean, we fight till victory or death. That's always my position. I mean, there are objective limitations which we can't overcome, or which we can shift the needle on, and but that's essentially it. Of course, we need to be creative. We mustn't compromise on the basics of our principles, and yeah. So. And the point of departure there is that, I mean, the working class alone can emancipate itself, but consciousness is not something that it's this process itself is a self-clarifying process, in a sense, you know. But I'd like to talk more on that, but I realize we're behind time. But what can economists do? That question is a good one, but I think it should be unpacked, and that there are economists and there are economists. I remember Queen Elizabeth did asking at LSE in the wake of the great. I mean, how come you guys, I mean, couldn't see this in your crystal ball? To be very brief on this, I think that the broad spectrum of heterodox economists need to boldly and clearly declare war on neoclassical economists, and I mean, there's no need for diplomacy in pointing out the inherently degenerate and bankrupt, you know, impact of that strand of economics in today's world. On Julia's question, actually it speaks to both the issues of anti-racism, but also in, migration itself, you know. And on that, I'll give a quick an insight on one of the things that as a global trade union federation we bring to bear on that. During the pandemic, the Philippines government decided to, I mean, the fact that I even did this, that is not defensible, also points at the shamelessness of the vaccine imperialism and the countries in the global north that pushed the ruling class of these countries. It's tried to do a nurses for vaccines deal with a number of countries, including Germany and the UK. So as PSI, what we did was, you know, we got our affiliates in the would have been destination countries to protest today, because at that point in time, the nurses were needed even more in the Philippines. And I mean, Unison took this up with the British government, you know, just as we also had with Verdi in Germany, and on the working class and anti-racism thing, and I'm happy you also referred to in Nigeria, where you have the political mobilization of ethnicity, ethnic differences. You see that with the ongoing general elections. And as I spoke on the example with the BLM, and the thing is, the trade unions are actually making effort, but I think much more can still be done. And the radical forces, socialist forces, civil society organizations, you know, also need to dig in this, you know, and I mean, there can be no question about it, about fighting racism with all we have in us. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Barbara. Obviously, we could discuss this for much longer, and it's very, very interesting. So, Lucia, over to you. Last word.
Okay, so about the question of whether there is evidence of a revival of the shop steward movement. So, what I would say is that one of the examples of what we could call some revival is the offshore oil and gas strike committee, which was created in the North Sea oil rigs and organized strike action in May and September against or independently of the Unite bureaucracy, and actually was met with quite a lot of hostility. But this is just an example of the possibility for workers to organize at the kind of workplace level independently of the bureaucracy, to organize strike committees, to take control of the action, take control over the union. And I think this is an example that is relevant when we think about what we can do, what should be done. Because I think that, well, as I try to say, if there is a kind of radicalization of the strike movement at the workplace level, this means a strategy of escalation that gives back control to the workers, and workers have the possibility of accept or reject offers and decide when and how to stop their action. And this kind of indefinite action also promotes kind of the possibility to coordinate with other struggles, and so also to move from local strike committees to kind of national strike committees within the same unions, and also between unions, in order to make sure that the workers' demands are met, and that we don't accept below inflation pay rises, as it seems like, for example, we are doing, but also it's happening in other sectors. And I think that this kind of radicalization and kind of taking control of the movement will inevitably clash against the priority of the governments to keep inflation low, keep military spending high. And so it raises a series of political issues, right? And I think there are implicit political issues about the privatization of the NHS, the question of public education, the question of climate change, where we can actually, if we make these political demands explicit, we can actually draw in broad sectors of society, and so there can be a kind of stronger movement linking labor and social struggles. And I think the question of, addressing the question of the war, so linking this movement to a rejection of military spending and the involvement of our states in this inter-imperialist war is also important, I think, to create connections and reinforce the anti-racist movement, the anti-racist movement today, because I think the question of the war is an important question that needs to be addressed. I mentioned that the unions actually published quite an interesting and important statement against the government and the scapegoating of refugees, but then the question is, what are they going to do? Are they going to mobilize the memberships, or are they just going to issue statements without mobilizing? And I think, again, the question is what members want to do. We need to take control over our action, and we need to create these social links, because these are, I think, the key questions, political questions we need to address. Otherwise, we will maybe achieve some limited results in terms of pay, but we want to address the kind of broader political economy causes of this situation, and so I think these are really important questions. And I think, as well, I'm talking as a political economist, I think it's important for us to basically make these connections explicit, and because I think a theoretical analysis is also important for the kind of political orientation of this movement.
Great. Thanks very much, Lucia. Thanks very much to all three of you for some really great reflections, a great presentation, and then really great answers. I think loads of food for thought, and I hope we're all propelled into action to make things better. So unfortunately, we've run out of time. And again, sincere apologies for all the technical problems we had today. But again, please join me all to congratulate and thank our speakers today for a really, really great presentation and some great insights. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Baba. Bye, Giulia.
Bye.
Bye, Chiara. Bye, everyone. Bye-bye.